There we go. Welcome, everybody. It's week 5 of our 6-week sheep management online course for the small farm programs at Cornell. And tonight we're going to talk about ID and record keeping. And then Richard Ehrhardt is going to be our guest speaker. Next week is our last week, and we're going to be talking about business and a little bit on housing and handling, and also look at what it costs to keep lambs, which is going to vary widely from farm to farm. But I'm going to hide the thumbnails here so we don't have to look at those. There you go. Yeah, but it is interesting to see, helps you decide what to price your lambs at if you know what it actually costs you. So I'm going to go down here, find my little controls. So let's talk about sheep ID. Sheep ID is surprisingly difficult. Seems like it should be an easy thing. We could put a man on the moon, but we can't keep all of our sheep ear tags in. So we're going to talk about ear tags, ear notching, tattooing, sheep paint, neck chains and collars, which I won't talk about those too much because they're usually used for goats, but you could use them, especially on hair sheep, and electronic ID. So sheep are notorious for losing their ear tags. And sometimes they just fall out, sometimes they rip them out. You name it, they've figured out a way to get them out. So let's talk about ear tags for a minute. There's all different kinds. I'm going to show you a picture in just a minute. Usually in our case, for lambs, we like to start with a little fold over tag. They come in different colors. We use different colors for different years. I try to go in rainbow order. Doesn't always work, but I try to stick to a pattern so I can sort of see how old a sheep is by looking at her ear tag. Those little tags don't stay in forever, but they do last a year or two, usually 3 years, 4 years maybe. So at least you got some. Hang on a minute. I just have Richard is texting me here. I'm just going to tell him we're on, and he's going to join us about 7:20. There are the 2-piece heavier ear tags. They have a pointy end and a hole in the other one, and you squeeze them on and the point goes through the hole and they click together. We don't use those on little lambs. You can. Our lambs are quite small, and when you put one of those, their head kind of tips to one side because it's heavy and uncomfortable for them. So we usually start with a fold over tag, and then as they get older, if we're going to keep them, we put a scrapey tag in if we're going to sell them, and if we're going to keep them, we do a tattoo, which includes our scrapey flock number. Tattoos are not easy, but they usually last a long time. Once in a while, we have a bad batch of tattoos, and we have like 066 question mark and 066 question mark the second and 066 question mark the third. We have a few of those, but most of them are pretty good, and we get better at it as we do it. There's some other things you need to think about while you're doing ear tags. Your feeder type can make a difference. Some feeders are more prone to catching their ear tags, like we feed through the cattle panels or anything they got to put their head through and then pull their head back out has a chance of catching the ear tag. So you might think about that. That might change where you want to put the ear tag in the ear as well. And some of them are real easy to see the numbers and some are not. The sheep that had her lambs tonight at the extension farm has a dark blue fold over tag with black numbers, and I couldn't see it even when I was like 2 feet away with a flashlight. So luckily she's tattooed and I can read her tattoo. And I know what ear she's from because she has a dark blue tag, but it really is a tough one to read. And I know when we pasture lambed and all I had was tattoos in the sheep, I had to like crawl around on the ground and try to look up into their ear to see the tattoo. It was not ideal either for that situation. So kind of to think about what your situation is and how you're going to see the numbers. And some of them are easier to put in when it's cold and some are not. The scrapey tags I currently have, I need 2 hands to squeeze the pliers, and I have really strong hands. If it's January and it's cold out, they're like solid. You can't push the little end through. So ease of application. There is a cost to ear tags. They all have some cost. And I always say the more tags, the better. So if mine have a lamb tag and then they get a scrapey tag or a tattoo, you have like 2 or 3 different methods so that if they lose one or you can't read the tattoo, you still can tell them apart. So here's, I'm going to get my little pointer here. These are the 2-piece tags down here in the lower left. And you can see one has a pointy end and one has a hole, and you put those in the special pliers and you squeeze them together through the ear. And you try to always get two that match, because you really can confuse yourself if you have two unmatching tags, and then you have another sheep with two unmatching tags, and then that's really bad. I've done it, but I don't recommend it. So be careful to always have somebody handing you the tags that's paying attention. The fold over tags here are different colors. They look like a little strip, and you fit them in a pair of pliers and you squeeze it through the ear, and it sits very close to the ear, which is nice. And these blue are metal tags. They were originally a scrapey tag that you put in meat lambs. They don't make those anymore, but they make, you can get regular silver or brass fold over metal tags, and you squeeze those on with the special pliers up on, usually on the top of the ear. And again, they stay in pretty well, but those are pretty hard to read. You have to get pretty close to them to see what the numbers are. These at the top were little loose. They're little tags that go on with a post and a hole, but they're much smaller than these scrapey tags down here. I really like these, but the scrapey program discontinued that style. But I have sheep that have kept those in for a long time. And this is a bucket of all the different pliers it takes to put all the different kinds of ear tags in. So keeping track of those and which pliers you need for which tags is something you learn through experience pretty much. Now I'm going to mention ear notching. I don't ear notch, but some of the big farms do ear notching instead of tagging. And they don't necessarily notch like the sheep's identification number into the ear. They're more likely to notch an ear, like this is, if it's a single lamb, it gets a notch here. So they know it's a single, and they maybe aren't going to keep it as a replacement. Or they maybe are going to notch a ewe that doesn't take care of her lambs. If they get 3 notches on the cull ear, they're gone, that kind of thing. Maybe they're just notching a certain notch pattern for each year, and that way they know how old the sheep are. So you have to decide what it is information you need the most. But I know a lot of the bigger farms do use ear notching to sort of categorize their sheep, if not directly ID each one. The little tool you use is up here, and it has like a little triangular piece that fits through the other piece and makes that little notch in their ear. I don't really like doing it. For some reason, I can put in ear tags and take off tails, but ear notching kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies. So let's talk about tattooing. If you don't have a lot of sheep, or you can keep up with the ewe lambs you keep, tattooing works really well as long as you have light colored animals. Doesn't work so well on black animals. Although lots of times you can see the tattoo if you have like a flashlight and can hold it behind the ear. Sheep don't really like to stand still while you do all that to look at their tattoo, to be honest with you. But I'm really glad I've tattooed these sheep at the extension farm, because I can't tell them apart. And I do sell a lot of breeding stock, so I like to have accurate records. So it's a lot of work to put in, but it lasts, and they don't lose their tattoos, and there's nothing to catch on the feeders. So if you're going to tattoo, it's a good idea to have 2 sets of pliers. And we use one for the scraping number, which happens to be NY25 for our flock, and one for our barn number. Now, if you use, a lot of the scraping numbers are 8 digits long, and I don't think anybody wants to tattoo 8 digits into their sheep's ear. So you might pick something, it could be your initials or something for your flock name that you could tattoo in one ear and the sheep's number in the other ear. You could also put the same number in both ears. And we pretty much number our sheep consecutively. And then you need a couple sets of pliers, and then you need to make sure you have a couple sets of numbers and letters so that you aren't halfway through and have to skip a number or something, which will add to confusion in your records. Then you need the tattoo paste and a toothbrush, and not for your teeth, but I'll show you how to use that in just a minute. Nice if you have a helper. And We like to do our sheep when they're like big weaned lambs, like, between 60, 70 pounds, maybe up to 80, 90. And I like to use the Premier deck chair, which it holds the sheep sort of in a sitting position, which I'll show you in just a minute. So this is some of the equipment you use. Here's the icky toothbrush and the paste tattoo. I also have roll-on tattoo paste. I've never really, I won't say I haven't had good luck with it because I haven't really used it that much. And then I use a little, like a fishing tackle box to sort of sort out the letters because I have different sized players. So I try to sort them by different sizes. In this little cup, I keep the NY25 so that I can always find it. And this is a small tattoo like for dogs and cats. And since I'm doing lambs, I found if I put the bigger letters like you use on a cow, if I put those in a small lamb, the numbers sort of grow and the dots get further apart. So I like to use smaller numbers in their ear. They also fit better. So this is a tattoo with a rubber pad, little springs. This one, it has some foam I put on it. The other one has cork. They all work. You just want to make sure when you squeeze it, they squeeze and they're straight because you don't want to be digging holes in one part of the ear and not in the other, not hitting the other. There's that nice toothbrush again. So here I put NY25 in this one first. And then I don't know if you can see right here, I squeezed it on the paper to be sure I had things in the right order. You're basically putting stuff in backwards. So it's always a good idea to check it on a piece of paper, at least the first few to get started. So then you can, keep changing it, but at least you got stuff in the right order. And our flock number is NY25, but I have to admit I had a couple NY52s over the years. And you can see here on the bottom one is 0900, that's so 900. And then you need to be sure you write it down and remember where you stopped so you don't end up with two of the same tattoo when you start up again. So I made it, this is the lamb was number orange 111 and his name was Robert. He was in the barn and named by the kids that worked there. And we put his tattoo number was 0900. And we do always 4-digit numbers. I'm not really sure why that is, but that's how we got started. So what we do is the lamb's in the deck chair, so he's sitting there. And if you look at the ear, there's 2 ridges there. I'm trying to hold the ear open, and I even remembered to wear gloves. And you put a little line of tattoo paste there. Then I take the toothbrush, I just smear it around, and then I squeeze the pliers. Try to hit that spot. Now, he doesn't have 2 fuzzy ears, so it isn't too bad. Sometimes they have kind of fuzzy ears and it's hard to get in just the right spot. Or maybe you put an ear tag in there in your way. That happens sometimes too. So that's what it looks like after you do it. There's a 0900. Here's his ear tag 111. And I tried when I put the lamb tags in, I try to put them close to the head so I have more room to tattoo. And then I take the toothbrush and I rub it in again into the little holes. And they will see how he's got green on him. He'll have green. They end up with green heads, which is a little hard to explain sometimes when you're giving a tour, but it does work. And I wish I had a picture of what it looked like after it healed. I tried to get one today actually off the sheep that was in the barn, but I couldn't get her to get a picture and have her hold still at the same time. There is electronic ID. There's different kinds of electronic ID, but basically they have a microchip and you have a reader. So in Canada, they use like a button tag that's a little round tag that has a microchip in it. And they're required to use one. So they use them in all their animals. I think I'd be tempted to use them in the ewes and not so much in the lambs unless I had some sort of an automatic reader. He has, in the picture, he has like a long reader that he can wave at the sheep. Sometimes it looks kind of like your phone, like a remote from your TV with a little row of numbers at the top. Sometimes you can directly download onto a computer, which is nice. You can read the microchip, put in the weight, send it to your computer. They are more expensive for each tag. And of course, you need a reader. Excuse me. But they may be required soon. So it's worth maybe, if you haven't started out, maybe you want to think about that. So I know they're going to be required for beef cattle in the US. They haven't required them for sheep yet, but that is a possibility, I would think. Sorry, my slides won't move. Come on. There we go. There's also paint for sheep. A lot of people are surprised to find out that there's actually sheep spray paint out there. It's easy to use, comes in all different colors, including white, so you can use it on your dark color sheep. It is temporary, but it lasts quite a while. It doesn't last as well on the hair sheep as it does on the wool sheep, interestingly. But we used to use only paint, and when we do vaccinating and foot trimming, we'd end up with sort of rainbow colored sheep. We use a different color each time to mark the ones we did. So we went to chalk, which is basically like sidewalk chalk. It's very temporary, but it'll last through, one vaccinating attempt. And then when they go out in the rain, it's all gone. So we like chalk for more temporary stuff, and we use paint more for when we need to mark like an animal that we gave a long-acting antibiotic or something to, where we really need to make sure we don't send that animal to the sale, or where we need to keep an eye on her to be sure her foot heals or whatever. So the paint, I think there's a picture here. Yeah, this is one of the brands that is pretty common. They're pretty nice spray paint. You can draw numbers, you can make smiley faces. We put question marks on some and dots on others. And actually, before we lamb, because we have the tattoos, I'll put all the sheep in a bunch, and I'll look at their ear and then spray paint their number on their back. That way, when they lamb, I don't have to mess with the ewe or bother her to look at her ear tag or her tattoo. I can just read the number on her back. It does take a little practice to make good numbers. I sometimes let the students do it, and that can be a challenge sometimes then trying to read them, but a fresh can I'll paint really nicely. Has nice little narrow spray tip. I haven't used this in a while, but we used to always use this. This is an oil-based paint. It is scourable, meaning it'll wash out of the wool. And I had two different sets of number brands. And so I had a big jar, it's actually up on the table there, that the brands would fit in, and I could dip the brands into the paint, and then you'd brand them onto the sheep. So you can make really nice looking numbers. And sometimes you can do things like put the ewes number on the lamb, or put the lamb's numbers on the ewes, so that you can tell who goes with who, that sort of thing. I haven't used this system in a while. I find the paint cans a lot easier, but these do work well and look nice. So now that you kept track of which sheep is which, so you know whose lambs go to who, and who their father was, and who had twins, what are you going to do with all that information? Like, it's really nice to have, but if you don't use it, it isn't really much use to you. So you need to figure out what info you want. Like, are you trying to keep track of growth, FAMACHA scores, their lineage or their pedigree, how many lambs they had, sometimes I'm just curious. I tend to keep ewe lambs out of the same ewes who are really good, and I sometimes have a lot of really closely related sheep if I'm not careful. How many times per year they lambed. So you want to think about what information you want to collect. And then how are you going to get that information you collected into the computer program? So you're probably going to have to sit down and enter it. Some people have it set up in the barn so they can, like when they're weighing lambs, they put it right in the computer. If it's not 10 below zero and you can do that, that's great, because it saves you one big step of trying to sit down someday and put it into the computer. And then when I say take lots of notes, I'm talking about you have like different ear tags. Like when I do lambing records, I try to always write a little note about the lamb, or it was born outside, or this one is also known as green 23. All those little notes will help you later to make your information more accurate. And if you can, there's a lot of phone apps. I'm going to show you where to look at those in a minute. But the phone apps are really, you can actually enter the things in the barn. And I think Richard's going to show you that also. And then how to get what you want out of the computer program. That can be a challenge sometimes too, even when the information is in there. Do you need lists? Are you looking for reports of a certain kind? And it's hard to know what you want until you start playing with it, I must admit. And does it interface with other programs? I'm going to mention NSIP later, the National Sheep Improvement Program. If you can take the information from your computer and just export it into these other programs, that'll save you a lot of work as well. And I don't want to imply that there's anything wrong with using a paper and a pencil or cards, or I have cardstock in a notebook. You know, if you only have a few sheep, it's very pleasurable to look through these records and make notes and write things down. It certainly works for small flocks. And I had somebody I noticed in the comments on the in one of the forums saying, you know, they only had 15 or 20 sheep. Did they really need flock filer? And so you don't need it every year, but if you haven't, you use it over the years, it's really nice to look back and see which animals really did well over time. So I'm just gonna mention flock filer because I've used it. There's quite a few programs out there. They all look pretty impressive. Actually, I opened quite a few today and took a look at them, but flock filer I find relatively easy to use, and it does interface with NSIP, or you can export things into Excel. There are other programs, and if you're really good at it, you can make one yourself, but I will say that flock filer is set up pretty well to do a lot of different things. And I just, oops, let me move my pointer. There we go. This is a picture of what it looked like on my computer screen. And you can see one of the nice things I like is find, because you can then click, say, breeder. So you want a list of all your ewes that are in the breeding flock, and you can click find, and it'll bring up just those reports, and then, or just those records, and then you can make a report. So it gives you a place to put the ID, has a place to put the tag number. Sometimes I have a name in there with that. You can put a picture. Not a bad idea if you can tell your sheep apart. I often put things here in the notes, and it gives you their birth date or when you got them, whichever, weaned, their father, their mother. I've used some of these down here to put sort of we have a code for the year, and when we used to lamb multiple times in the year, we had a code to put in down there. Tells you their age, you can put their breed, their weight at weaning usually. And see here, it says weight tag 21. So she had another tag. That's a good thing to know. And then where they are. So there's and there's other places. I can't obviously go around and move around on this slide, but you can go to those different entries, and they give you some blank spots to put stuff in. So if you want to keep track of Hamacha scores, for example, you can make a spot to do that. And this is just a picture of a report I drew up. You don't have to read it, but that was my ewes. This was their age. This was their mother. This was whether they were a twin or a single or a triplet. And I think this was the sire over here. And it was just a way to draw up an inventory of my ewes and to see how old they were. Like sometimes I realize I have a couple 10, 12-year-old ewes in my flock. And then last but not least, there's a great list at the sheepandgoat.com out of Maryland. They have a great sheep and goat webpage. And this is under, it says, well, actually I have the actual URL on the next slide, but it has a whole list of these. You can click here and go see the different ones. Tells you how much they are. Some of them are like a subscription where you pay so much a month. Some of them you buy, and then you probably have to pay for updates or something like that. Some of them are just apps that go on your phone. I was surprised at how many there are now. And I looked at quite a few of them. I was pretty impressed with what you could do with them. So I would recommend you get the one that's easiest for you to use because you're more likely to use it. And I wanted to mention NSIP. I mentioned it for a minute earlier. It's a great way to measure predicted differences that you can gain through genetic improvement. And it's mostly used by purebred people, although I do know there are some commercial flocks that are big enough that they can sort of compare animals within their flock, or there's enough similar flocks that they can compare to. It isn't cheap, but it is, it's really nice. For example, when I want to buy a ram, if somebody has NSIP records, and they can say there's a predicted difference in weaning weights or a predicted difference in growth after weaning or mothering ability or lambing ease, that sort of thing. It gives you some information that you wouldn't normally have. So to do NSIP, you have to enroll your sheep, you have to give it the information about them, and then you need to keep track of 30-day weights, 60-day weights, 120-day weights. That's whatever it is you decide to do the measuring on. And you have to turn those in, and then you get back information on your, say, ram lambs that you might want to sell for breeding. It's a great program. I have talked about joining it. I have not actually done it. Actually, my Katahdins were going to go on, but the flock which I was going to do it with, who I was getting rams from, went out of business, and then I sort of lost interest. But it's a great program, and I would encourage you, if you're interested in that sort of thing and into selling breeding stock, that it would be a great thing to do. This is the website for the apps, the phone apps. I think you could do them, a lot of them you could do on the computer or the phone. And I think that's all I have for ID and records. I'm going to, whoops.
And Betsy, Richard has joined us.
Excellent.
So, and for whatever reason, I cannot shift him to a co-host, so you'll have to do that.
Okay, I have something weird going on with my Zoom also. Hang on a second.
Okay, sorry.
There's just like a, oh, maybe if I stop sharing, that would help. There, that's better. Welcome, Richard. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Yeah, sure. Glad to be here.
I guess do you want us to show the recording, or would you like to start out from the beginning?
I'll talk. I think that makes more sense.
Didn't know if you maybe were trying to eat a little dinner or something. I wanted to give you a chance.
Oh, yeah, no, that's fine. Thanks.
So I introduced you a little bit before, but why don't you tell
Okay.
people a little more about what you do and where you're from and that sort of thing?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm the sheep and goat specialist at Michigan State, and I've been here, since about 2009. I relocated here actually from upstate New York. So I knew Betsy a little bit there. And yeah, so I studied at Cornell University. I had a commercial sheep flock there, which I've moved to Michigan with me. It's this little smaller version of what I used to do. And yeah, I'm an extension specialist, but that's a pretty broad title. I have a research appointment. So I do some applied research. I teach in both the veterinary college and uh, animal science department. And then, yeah, I do a lot of extension work like this. So that's pretty much where I'm coming from.
Are you having to teach Zoom courses to your students?
Oh yeah. I taught sheep production last fall via Zoom, and it went okay. I had to recreate the labs, and I did a lot of video. I did like 30 videos that were pretty extensive. And fortunately, because of travel restrictions, I at least had my backyard farm to use. So that worked out okay. But yeah, it was
sounds very challenging.
It was a lot of work.
Yeah, that you weren't planning on, probably.
Right. Yeah, I had to adjust my time for that, for sure.
So I did make you a co-host.
Okay. Yeah, I'll see what I can do here. Looks like I can share my screen. So I got that.
If not, I have your PowerPoint up to use. So.
Yep.
Oh, here it comes. Yep, you just got to get into slideshow mode there.
Yep. It looks like I have
perfect.
I have control.
Good.
So yeah, I'll be glad to get into it here. So I'm going to talk about a few different topics. Betsy asked me to kind of share some of my personal farm background. She thought that might be of value to the class. And so I'm going to be talking about that in the beginning as kind of just a model or I don't know, case study of a farm. You can kind of see why I do the things that I do. And then I do, like I said, I do some applied research, and I do work in a number of areas. And one of them is using cover crops, which are commonly planted in crop farming systems in the United States. And we have them all over the Midwest, especially. So we have these opportunities to potentially graze these with sheep, and it works really well. And so I've done some work to kind of evaluate how we can use those to even finish lambs. So I thought I'd talk about that as a little bit of a different topic too. Um, so let me start off talking about my farm. Here's just a long, narrow strip. It's about 28 acres that we can graze. And I'll try to go over a few things here. If you can see my cursor, I think you can. Maybe I'll get a fancier pointer there.
Yeah, there's actually, you got it.
Oh yeah, yep. Yeah, I've been zooming my life away lately. So yeah, so essentially here it is. It has a perimeter fence around the outside, which is one of the first things we established because uh, that's a good initial investment. I was fortunate to be able to build a barn here. This was essentially a soybean field, so we converted it into a sheep farm. I designed this barn, which I'll show you more pictures of. And this overview gives you a picture of the infrastructure of the farm a little bit. This long line here is one subdivision fence. It ends right here and starts actually at the barn. And then I have another subdivision fence going here. And what this does is effectively kind of splits the farm into three long, narrow strips. And what that allows me to do is to harvest the excess pasture or forage as silage or dry hay pretty easily without having a bunch of little fields in the way. And you can kind of see here in this Google map view, I think is what it is. You can see how I rotate them. I just run electronet kind of in a north-south direction here. And I just make little micro paddocks, and we change the size of these electronet paddocks depending on how many sheep are in the grazing group and how fast the grass is growing, essentially, things like that. So that's how we have a flexible system where we can create smaller paddocks. You can see here a few other things. So you can see, I think these are little specks. You can see some sheep here in these two paddocks. There's probably some sheep back here. We've got usually two grazing groups going. Here's another mob going here. And so what you see here is a compost pad we have where we stack our baled silage, our barn, of course. And what else was I going to point out? Oh, just the simple fact that here we show you, I'm showing you how I spread. I just had this picture must have been taken about the middle of June, maybe the third week of June. And what I've done here is I've spread all the compost off this pad. You can see it's pretty empty. And I've spread it on a field here. And that's maybe a fifth of the farm, maybe a sixth of the farm, maybe it's 4 acres or so. And what I do each year is I renovate a section of the farm by putting the compost of that year on the farm onto the land. And then the cycle starts off, we actually kill the pasture. So we find a pasture that perhaps needs renovation for different reasons. We will graze it maybe for 2 cycles early in the spring during May and early June. Then I put Roundup on it and I kill it. And then I put all the compost on it, which is pretty well broken down. It's not fully composted, but probably 80% decomposed. Supply that on the field. Then I simply direct drill right through the compost and sod like an annual forage that I can start grazing in July or August. Then the next spring, we plant another type of forage, which I'll show you pictures of. And that kind of completes our renovation cycle. One last thing is I've got a little laneway, which is very useful. So we can bring sheep that have problems in pretty quickly off of our fields. So here's just a picture of the compost pad. I know it's like, why are you showing a picture of a manure stack? Well, it's an important part of the farm. This was built from an NRCS cost share program. So, when I started, that's something you ought to be looking into if you want to start a sheep farm or any kind of farm, really, is see what opportunities you have for cost share through NRCS. So this was pretty well paid for by the cost share. I don't think there was much out of pocket money for me involved in it. They probably won't build a compost pad like this again. Or design one, because nowadays they put a roof over the top of them, so they actually look like a barn, and they'll pay for that too, which is probably better. But at this particular time, they allowed for this cement structure here, which works well for me. And so we compost the manure by turning it over a few times with a skid loader. You can see my manure spreader here, and that greatly reduces its volume, and that serves as like our fertility soil building exercise for the whole farm. Since we've been doing this now for about 10 years, we've pretty much run across the whole farm. And our forage yield, I'm I don't have a precise number to give you, but I would say it's a good double of what it was when we started. So the carrying capacity of our farm is just really expanded with the use of our own uh, recycling our own nutrients through the farm. Okay. So yeah, so our focus is on uh, harvesting quality forage, whether it be in the form of excess forage for winter feed. Here I show you a picture of me. You can tell the leaves aren't quite on the trees yet; they're just starting to. So this would be sometime maybe the third week of May, and so we've cut our first cutting here before that it just before it kind of seeds out, and then we wilt this to about 50% moisture and harvest it right away as baled silage. And that's our biggest harvest, is that first harvest. Our climate here in central Michigan is probably similar, very similar to central New York. Probably where Betsy lives is going to be colder, but still our growing season, we can harvest pretty well in May here and provide some pretty good quality. I would estimate that we probably cut about 75% of the farm for silage during the first cutting. The other 25% were grazing. We have ewes on pasture, even lambing on pasture, as I'll describe. So yeah, it's a family business. It's really, I guess, whether my kids like it or not, this farm is for them. No, it's a great opportunity for us to raise our kids on a farm. I've got two sets of twin boys, one of each set here, who are younger and older, and so they're basically my farm labor. Um, our rotational grazing program, I described a little bit with that overview picture. Here I show a little more up close of a group. Looks like this would be perhaps early August. It's been look like fairly wet year. I've got pretty good growth here in early July. The lambs here are probably, between 3 and maybe 5 weeks old, and we're probably moving these sheep every 2 days approximately. So there's a lot of pasture here. Normally when we do our rotations, our forage isn't quite as mature as it is here, but still there's pretty good quality here. And when it is a little more mature, we'll increase our stocking rate and have smaller pastures simply by, the width of the field established by electronet fencing here. Oh, here's a picture of our kind of intermediate plant species in our rotation. So that first year, I usually grow brassica type forage. So either a forage rape or turnip or something of that nature, depending on when I want to graze it. And then the second year, and maybe the third and fourth, we put in what I call a short-term perennial pasture. So it is a pasture that lasts a few years, but kind of runs itself out because the forage species are very high quality. Like you can see here, there's a whole boatload of red clover here and a good amount of ryegrass, which isn't as dominant in the seeding right now. And sometimes these seedings will add some forb species, and those would include things like chicory and plantain. And so essentially, we've got like this very high quality forage that we principally graze. We don't harvest because it's so wet. We don't harvest it for machine harvest, but we will put our lambing ewes over this, and they milk really well on this. So this is a yearling ewe, I can tell you. She's probably 13 months old, and here's two lambs, maybe a week old. And what we've actually studied this, and we found that these ewes actually at this age, normally they just lose a tremendous amount of weight when they're raising twins and they're still growing. But we found that these ewes can maintain their weight on pasture, meaning they're lactating at a high rate and even maintaining their body reserves. And and we've compared it to rearing the same cohorts indoors, and they do just as well as if we're feeding them grain. So that was kind of interesting, but it does take some specialized management. If you were to travel to New Zealand, you would find that their more productive sheep are raised on pastures just like these, and that's kind of where I got my idea from. Well, I shouldn't give them too much credit, but it's a similar. We're thinking the same way at least. Here's just a picture of a type of annual forage I might grow. This happens to be not a brassica species, but it's a radish. It's a grazing radish that you can buy. It's available in the United States, and it's got this. You can't really see the bulb here, but it isn't going the ground very far. It's got a relatively small bulb, but a giant top. And that's a pretty good species that grows well. That like we could establish that in June and start grazing it in August and maybe graze it 2 times even if we don't graze it too hard. Here's another species of annual forage that we've grown as part of our rotation. This one I've stockpiled and I'm grazing it in fall. I think this picture is taken probably late October, early November. And you can see we're actively grazing it here with strip grazing. It's kind of a pain to graze in some ways because you got to stick a piece of fencing through this jungle. I've actually got a video of sheep. Sheep are kind of afraid to enter it at first because it's so formidable, foreboding for them because it's just so thick. But it looks really impressive. People are always like, "Wow, that's amazing," because it's like 4 feet tall, and it was planted. Yeah, so this was planted actually in July, so it's a fairly short growing season for so much biomass. Actually, that shorter plant that I showed you, my son had a picture of him carrying, the radish, actually produces as much biomass as this, but you just don't perceive it because it's not as tall. And another thing about this stuff, it leaves a lot of stalks. None of that's bad. I'm just saying it's a little overstated its value, but it does look really cool. And the reason why it's so green and lush is because we just took a year of manure and put it on this, or a year of compost and put it on this field. So this whole system for us is a way to build our soil carbon, to increase the fertility of our fields, and to have these kind of benefits with all this forage. So another aspect of what we do is we expand our grazing operation off of the home farm. So I live in a area of southern Michigan where there's fairly large cropping farms. There isn't that much livestock actually, which is kind of interesting. It's changed over the years. So there's farms, 3,000-4,000 acres that they pretty much have through a wheat, um, corn, soybean rotation. So when they grow the wheat, that's a pretty sweet opportunity for us to put a cover crop in. So they harvest this wheat. It's a winter wheat crop. So they harvest it in July. And then these fields normally in the olden days would just be left fallow until um, the crop was planted the next spring. But what they do now is they plant a cover crop to help, maintain soil nutrients and protect it better and do a better job of building soil carbon. So the first couple of years I was there, I was like, my neighbor who I've become friends with, of course, he's like, "Hey, would you like to bring your sheep over and graze my cover crop?" And I said, "Well, thank you for the invitation." So I went over there, grazed his cover crop, and then after that went so well the first year, he enjoyed having the sheep on the farm. He thought it had some benefit to his cropping program. So we take basically all the ewes, or half the ewes from our farm, and we move them onto cover crops. And since then, I've established a relationship with him where I have paid for the seed for the cover crop. And I actually also fertilize the cover crop, which sounds kind of weird because I'm only, getting the value of the cover crop. But I've found that the fertilizer, the response I get by fertilizing this cover crop, I double the yield and it's an economic return for me. I don't have to move my fences as often. I get radishes with bulbs that are like the size of a grapefruit some years. And so it's just a worthwhile investment. He likes that because then he gets some nitrogen credit that I've paid for. So everyone's pretty happy with the situation. I have to, obviously I have to bring my own fencing. There's no water on these fields that you can bring to it. But the fact is, this crop here is just so lush. It's got so much water in it, and you're grazing it. So we bring our sheep there in October, and we graze them through about the middle of January. It's a time of year where the sheep, number one, don't need much water. Number two, the crop contains all the water they need. And number three is if it snows, which it tends to snow late November through December, we've got that water as well. So it's a pretty good system. We keep dogs out of the sheep, dogs and coyotes, with electronet fencing, and the sheep stay in pretty well. So that's what we use to graze off of our farm. Here's just a picture. This would be, I think, around Thanksgiving time last year. We had a little bit earlier snow and one of these purple top turnips in the snow. Here's the sheep grazing through the snow. and it looks really nice. So this is mostly a mixture of, it's about a bushel of oats and maybe 6 pounds of a combination of tillage, radish, and purple top turnips. And sometimes we put some rape and kale in there too. It's not so important, but it, you know, it's a nice, this was actually a poor cover crop year. We didn't get as much, but the quality was awesome. And even in years where it's been droughty in the late summer and we haven't had as much cover crop growing, it's been worth it because, you know, we'll have 50-acre field that I pay for the seed for. It'll cost me, say, you know, $1,000, but the feed I get off of that, it's worth, you know, just $10,000. So it's a really good value. Yeah. So as I mentioned, we put electronet fencing up here. My kids are a little unusual. They like to wear shorts in the middle of winter for some reason, but that's okay. They work hard. Yeah, so you can see how we set this up in tire tracks and we can graze right through the snow. So here is a picture of us walking our ewes home then in January. So this would be, sometimes we trailer them home, sometimes we walk them home. And so these ewes are going to be shorn and going to lamb in the wintertime. And that's the end of that cycle then. And you can see they're in pretty good shape. These ewes are, you know, getting really wide and full of lambs. The other thing is they have, like, not that our wool is a major value for us, but they do have very clean fleeces and they come off of this in very good body condition. As Betsy mentioned, we use a little bit of paint on our sheep. You can see the spray paints we use to mark them for vaccinations or preg checks or whatever. Occasionally we use some marking crayons on some sheep to mark them this sheep, just to make sure that, you know, to make sure the rams were working. We have a few ewes marked here. So getting back to my farm infrastructure a little bit, here's a picture of my barn. This was when it was brand new. Right now, it doesn't look quite so spanking nice, but this was like the first fall I used it. But essentially what we have here is a center aisle feeding system. So this is a cement pad that's perhaps 12 or 13 inches off the pen floor. And so the animals reach their heads through here and they eat right here. So we'll pour grain here on either side. You can see a sheep's head there. And then we'll bring baleage in here or dry hay or whatever. We'll either unroll a bale in this aisle or we'll split it, as I'll show you. So here's my old farm in New York, but same principle. We had a center aisle feeder, and here I'm showing a picture of me splitting a bale. And we do that. You know, this isn't the only way you can do this. There's lots of ways you could process bales. I already own this skid loader. I just found this was a useful tool for me. It wasn't very expensive. And so basically it takes a round bale and it cuts it, and it's easier to disperse that way. So to kind of give you a summary, we grow the majority of our forage for our flock on 28 acres. I'd say that supports, we have about 200 ewes, 190 ewes on 28 acres. And I would say we get 85% of our forage off of that for the whole year, maybe 80%. So we have, as I mentioned, we have a 6 to 8 year rotation, in the sense that that's how long it takes before we get back to another renovation cycle. Yeah, and I described our grazing management and how we use baled silage for a lot of our feed, and what our focus is, which is on either harvesting the fields when they're optimal state for grazing. So if I get a lot of grass growing too fast, we just simply harvest the excess for silage. So we probably harvest 75% in May. Then around the end of June, 1st of July, we might harvest, say, 50%. And then depending on the year, we might harvest 30% in August and maybe a little in September as well. So here's a picture of our barn before we did some renovations on and some additions on it, but this was when it was new. We have a picture, and just a couple things here. This is the wintertime, obviously. We have these panels here, which are 4x8 panels, which we actually just, they're insulated panels, so we can take off really easily. We just unscrew these little white slats. And so that allows us in the summertime to have a lot more air movement through the barn. But in the wintertime, it creates a little bit, some insulation, and then we put there's a curtain here we shut and open depending on the weather. So this is an indoor lambing, insulated lambing unit here. So the ceiling, I think I showed you before, is steel line. The only reason why it is because it has an insulated attic, and that keeps the moisture or the heat in the barn. So like, it's been below zero most nights this week and last week, and we've just had about 150 lambs born in the last 10 days. And we've had very few problems with chilled lambs because the whole barn's above freezing, even sub-zero temperatures. So here's just a picture of our handling system, very simple. Design just has this crush gate here. And, our handling system is a flexible use area. We also park vehicles in parts of it. So it has multi-use, it's a multi-use area. And we built this yard, which I didn't show you in the original picture, with the NRCS support. And we built that compost pad. We also built this, they call it a winter sacrifice yard, where we could house our ewes in winter and have them on water. We don't necessarily have to have them under a roof in the winter, but it works pretty well. It doesn't work very well for lamb feeding because they track all the snow in the barn, but for ewes, it works really well. So there's a little video of inside of my barn. These would be lambs. I think it's probably going to be, I'm guessing, the middle of winter. I'm not sure if this is late fall or winter. Let me see if I can play this video somehow here. I think I need to. Okay, yeah. I guess I can do that. It should play. Cannot play media, it says. That's weird. Never had. I could try this. This might work. Cannot play media. Huh.
We'll have to imagine them jumping around.
Yeah. Well. Oh, okay. Well, yeah. So you got a bunch of lambs jumping around in the barn, and oops. I don't know why that's not working. Maybe I'll try it later. Yeah. So here's another picture of ewes on. Put it back in presenter mode here. Here's another picture of ewes lambing on pasture. So we do some of our lambing on pasture. This year, this particular picture was taken in the fall. So we do some pasture lambing even in the fall. The month of September, as it turns out, is a good time of year to lamb on pasture. So what I didn't, I'll back up a second. What I didn't tell you is that our ewes are on an 8-month birth cycle. So some people call that accelerated lambing. And so we ask them to lamb every 8 months, and they usually agree and think it's okay to do that. We get about 90% of them doing it, I would say. And the ones that don't, we usually get rid of. Most all sheep do a pretty good job at this, though. And so one of our lambing periods, so they lamb at, we have 4 periods during the year. The ewe gets a chance to lamb every 8 months. So they lamb at a different point of the calendar every year if they're on this cycle. One of the birth periods is like mid to late September. The other one is like right now. We just had a lot of lambs born in the last 10 days. And the other one is in late May. So this is the fall lambing group. Sometimes we lamb these in pasture, sometimes we lamb them indoors. That's pretty dependent on how much fall grazing we have. Here's some ewes again during the fall, getting ready to give birth, close to lambing. So our flock is derived actually from Cornell sheep. We bought some commercial sheep that had a lot of Cornell, Finn, and Dorset, and then we got some rams through Cornell. I've added some other types of genetics, like there's a continental breed called the Ile-de-France that's we've used that they lamb out of season okay, and they're very muscular and they've got some good traits we've incorporated into the flock. We use some polypay genetics because they are pretty complementary to what we're doing. They're a little bit bigger actually than the Finn Dorsets, and they're pretty well selected. They have pretty good data on NSIP, so that's another reason why I like the polypays. They, each of these sheep has some faults and each of them has some great traits. And Dorset genetics we've also added. I would describe them as a fairly early maturing, muscular, prolific, and aseasonal breed. So that those are their main traits. We select them pretty hard for lamb numbers, ability to breed out of season, and for their milk production. The way we measure milk production is basically by 60-day weaning weights and consistency of that over time. Our ewes are kind of moderate size. We don't want to get them over 175 pounds. I found that when I use polypays, they get a little too big. So we kind of moderate that. Um, so our ewes generally have a 200% or a little bit better lamb crop. I think we're over 200% right now in February. We've had just a whole lot of triplets born in the last 3 or 4 days. And our conception rate varies depending on season. It can be as low as 80% for spring mating. Usually it's a little better than that. And it's generally pretty high, like 95% for the other more normal season matings. We market our lambs a number of different ways. Here's a picture of some hothouse lambs that I sold. These would be like for Greek Easter. They're like 65 pound lambs. In Michigan, we have we have a market for these. You guys in the East Coast have a pretty much bigger market for these. We also sell a good number of lambs to the non-traditional market that are closer to 100 pounds, which seems to be kind of a sweet spot. Here's a picture of these hothouse lambs. We also sell some lambs to the traditional market, which are larger, which would be 130, 140 pound lambs. Our sheep, which I like about our sheep, is that we can put them in different directions depending on market opportunities. So they're kind of a moderate size ewe, but they're big enough to produce a large lamb and small enough to still produce a small lamb with the same genetics. One of the ways that we make some of our marketing decisions is I've developed a tool with a colleague. Her name's Erin Rechtenwald. And we've worked together and developed this thing we call the MSU Lamb Profit Calculator. You might find it useful. There's the URL if you'd like to access it. This gives you an opportunity to calculate like your potential profit from different marketing scenarios. You can put in all of your farm's information, its productivity, the types of feed, the cost of your feed, your rearing method, all these things. It's actually a pretty involved program, but it'll spit out like you could change anything. So you could change market conditions. You could see what the profit is on a per lamb or per ewe basis if you're marketing 40 pound lambs in April versus maybe growing those same lambs to 80, 90 pound lambs in June versus growing them to 120, 30 pound lambs in August or September. You can kind of project those figures into this. They're not going to be the perfect crystal ball, but they'll give you a pretty good idea of which on average is going to be maybe a better market option for you. You can model all sorts of things like the impact of, culling harder, the impact of more lamb mortality if you made an improvement from 15% to 8%, changes in conception rate and prolificacy. All these things you can evaluate how they would affect your bottom line. So I just want to make you aware of that. We do sell some breeding stock. I guess I'm not sure why this picture's in here. It just shows you the kind of sheep we have. These were a bunch of rams born in the fall. So we do sell some breeding stock. And here's another group, the probably fall born rams in the early winter or late winter. So our record keeping, we do keep individual records on our ewes. We take some little bit of time to do that. So we have lambing records, and we record this information, their date of birth, of course, number of lambs born and reared. We keep track of if there's lambs that die, if they died from, let's say, difficult birth, we call it dystocia. If they died from starvation exposure, which isn't too common anymore on our farm, we write that down. If they die from, trauma or something, we've got different codes for all of these things. We note their behavior. If we've got ewes that are good moms or better moms or, flighty or what have you, we'll note some of that. I do like to note the soundness of the mammary gland, whether the size of the teats and how much milk she has, at least from a quick characterization by looking at them when they first lamb. I will also know what the functional output is of their mammary by weighing their lambs, which is more important, which would be these adjusted 60-day weaning weights. We keep track of the ewes that breed and don't breed, and we get rid of them pretty quick. We usually give them a second chance to breed because there's a lot of environmental impact on conception rate. but if we perceive there's any fertility problem, they're gone pretty quickly. We have some ewes that get to be pretty old on our farm. Sometimes we've had 10-year-old ewes that are still, having triplets every 8 months. But as soon as they slow down and miss a lambing, we that's generally when we call them. Yeah, so there's different ways we've done record keeping. Here's a picture of one of my older boys. This was a long time ago, actually. He just used like a Google Doc, a spreadsheet on shared through Google. And he would record information in the barn. It's kind of nice because then I could go in there, record information, and it's all kept in the cloud. He could, and we'd all access the same sheets and keep track of things that way. Just an example of what we keep track of. We have the ewe. Each of these prefixes here is the sire for that ewe. That's how I keep track of my sheep. The date, how many lambs they had. We had the mammary score, which we keep. Then we have, this is unusual information. This year, we were doing some standardized fecal egg count on all the lambs born. They were exposed to a standardized challenge, and we had fecals on them. We don't normally do that, but we did it at that time. And you can see, and we were interested in seeing how these different sires differed in the fecal egg count of their offspring. We keep track of weaning weights, and if they die, that's DYS, stands for dystocia, and we make different comments in the simple spreadsheet. So the way we select our ewes is for conception rate. We only keep replacements from dams that land in the fall successfully without missing interval and exposure. We're looking for pounds of lambs weaned and some consistency. We don't want our sheep to be giant, so we kind of try to moderate that. We don't want them to be overly aggressive or wild, I guess would be the better word, so that they're easier to handle. There are some differences in temperament you see with sheep, and I find that their offspring tend to share those traits. I wouldn't say we necessarily select for maternal bonding behavior, except if we don't see it, which is really never happens. So I should probably cross that off because it's just there. We haven't really done selection for it yet. If we ever had a problem with it, we wouldn't keep the sheep, but they all are good moms, right? As far as I'm concerned. It's kind of interesting. Some ewes are different kinds of moms. Some ewes will hover over their lambs. Some ewes will run away from them when people come, like a white-tailed deer. So they're all a little different. It's interesting. We do worry about mammary soundness. We don't want big balloon teats that we have to milk out to get them to shrink down so lambs can suckle. And we find that, these things are associated with incidents of mastitis too. We do select for some mass and muscling in the ewes, not as strong as we would in rams. And we don't want them to have like poor mouths or feet or really long pasterns. We don't normally have to trim the sheep's feet because they're on pasture at least half of the year. And so that naturally wears them. But if we do notice that there's feet that are growing unusual, and usually that means they have poor pasterns, we might choose to trim those feet, and we might even call those ewes or not keep their offspring at least. Just a picture of a ram we've used that we created that has, combination of the genetics I described. So our rams are the same as for ewes, but they could never miss a breeding interval. And we usually keep them from older ewes that have a proven record of this. So we make sure they're large testicles. We put a more emphasis on their structure and their mass and their feet and legs because they're going to be passing those traits on to their offspring. And I'd say we might keep maybe 1 out of 200-300 rams to use in our flock that are born. And we added genetic diversity pretty conservatively. So we might bring a new ram in, made them to 10 or 15, what we think are our best ewes based on their records, and then keep a son. And that's how we don't get too invested in genetics that might not improve our sheep. So anyhow, that's what I have on my own farm. I don't know if it makes sense for me to take some questions on that or now, because it's a little bit different chapter that I'm going to be covering, or would you like me to talk about the next project?
Well, I'd like to know who does your shearing because it's such a nice job.
Well, if they're old pictures, I did it. And then if they're newer pictures, I have a really good sheep shearer for sure, because he's a world class shearer. Actually, he shears in New Zealand, Australia, and just happens to be living here in Michigan. His name's Tim Wright, and I would give him a plug any day. He's a really nice guy too. But
Whoever did ours last year left lots of sideburns and
yeah,
top knots and
yeah,
little pieces on the back, and those pictures are so nice. They look so smooth, and of course they're in great physical body condition, so that helps with the shearing too.
yeah, definitely. I used to be a professional shearer, so I admire good shearing, and so I try to keep it on my farm. Like, I'd be disappointed if someone did a bad shearing job, but I know you can't always be too selective on that.
Yep.
Yep.
So, well, that was really actually really interesting. Every year I'm so impressed with your forage program, and wish we could even do that at the cooperative extension farm, but it's hard to, it's a lot of moving parts there to have
It
equipment
is.
that's working and have the right
Yep.
weather. And I see you taking off feed in May, and you must have a pretty good drainage on your fields.
Yeah, we do. We in New York, we could do some of that too, but we have better drainage on the fields here. And on campus, the campus farm, it's taken a while, but we're getting to the point where we're starting to do more of the better pasture management too. It just takes,
Mhm.
it's hard. You need like the right sort of, what do you want to say, mindset,
Right.
and that's sometimes hard to create. But lately, last year or two, it's just get people are sort of appreciating the value of it more.
That's good. It is hard when you're, well, the cooperative extension farm, same thing. You have a lot of programs happening, so
Yeah, yeah,
it's hard to make a priority out of the everything.
I think what,
yeah.
Richard, you also shared about NRCS, and it sounds like quite a bit of the group weren't familiar with Natural Resource Conservation Service.
Yep.
And I would just say that there's some initiatives with soil health improvement, and actually there's some programs now for cover cropping and pastures. So it's relatively new, but if you're interested in that, I think that's an avenue. And again, encourage people to get back to or make those connections with your local NRCS staff and Soil and Water Conservation Service, or whatever the comparable is in other states.
Right.
You have a couple of questions here. What do you do for minerals when you're pasturing off farm?
Yeah, I didn't show that. I just provide free choice minerals. So we have these, little mineral feeders that we move from paddock to paddock. They're kind of small, and it's basically a trace mineralized salt. So it's a salt product. Doesn't have any, you know, calcium or phosphorus in it. It's just 95+% salt, and it's enriched primarily in selenium, iodine, cobalt. Those are the big ones we look for. And so that's what you do for mineral. And then for our feed, like in our grain, we put the same salt product in our grain, as it's kind of, mineral package for the grain too.
Is
One
that
other question.
one, or
Oh, I'm
is
sorry.
that one that you designed yourself?
The mineral,
Yeah.
um, well, sort of. Just because of my professional role, like the company was making a mineral
Mhm.
that I work with, and they adjusted it a little bit because they wanted some input from me on it. So I guess I had some influence on it, but like I increased the iodine levels because we had some goiters in lambs
Mhm.
grazing brassicas. But no, it's actually nothing really unusual about it. The nice thing is it's a small company that has like half the price of the larger companies, because they kind of cater more to, it's interesting, they cater to small farms and large commercial dairies, and large commercial dairies won't pay these crazy prices.
Ah,
So it's actually a really good mineral product. I don't think you can get it in New York, but it's called Marvel Mineral. I shouldn't plug too many things here, but it's a good mineral. You could probably find something decent too.
mhm. I was just curious. There's so many different choices. It's hard to know what to
Yep.
use sometimes.
One other
And
question was, why do you put Roundup on the fields before you put your compost on it?
Yeah. So the idea with that is, we could till the fields instead, but it's just very efficient to kill it with herbicide, because we're trying to drill and establish new seedlings through this compost. They wouldn't like established if it was a living sod. So that's why we kill it first, so that the manure itself won't kill it because it's compost. And so we just drill with a no-till drill. Yeah, I've got a whole talk I could sometime give on that if that was of interest, but that's the best answer I can give you.
So you're not plowing that up then at all?
No, I don't, and that's why I kind of can work on a small farm. So I just borrow the no-till drill from NRCS office,
Yep.
um, and that works really well. I in New York, I didn't have access to those as easily. Well, actually, I did, but like sometimes they weren't calibrated; they weren't in good shape. And I've actually done just with instead what I did there, which worked really well, is I did use herbicide, one herbicide application, and then I just disc the dead sod, and I got enough disruption to incorporate the compost plus make a good seed bed, and then I just put a culture packer over it. So I didn't really do any deep tillage at all, and
Yeah, interesting.
that worked really well. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think we should move on. I'd like to
Okay.
hear.
Yep.
I'm dying to hear about your study that
Okay.
you did with the cover crops.
Yeah, so I'll see if I can get this going here again. Yeah, so this is a project I did with a number of other people, including Kim Cassida, who's our forage agronomist. She's our specialist, and she likes sheep and goats, so it's really cool. She's working with me, and so I've showed you this picture, like why would we integrate livestock into sheep farming systems or excuse me, sheep into crop farming systems. It has a lot of benefits for both the sheep farmer and for the crop farmer. Um, by paying for the cover crop seed, which a sheep farmer might be doing or livestock farmer might be doing, you're going to lower the cost of the cover crops, of the cover crop. All the farmer has to do is take the time to plant it then. So that's the advantage to the farmer. You might get some enhanced recycling of the cover crop by grazing it, which is another advantage. A disadvantage could be if these animals compacted the soil. We've seen some very minimal soil compaction of grazing that's easily disrupted by conventional tillage. So I don't want to say there's zero, but it isn't of an impactful nature for the future crop. And so, yeah, basically for the crop farmer, it's a way for them to reduce the cost of their cover crop, which they already wanted to plant. And the sheep farmer, you get heaps of sheep forage. And so you can basically, around here, you could have a pretty large flock of sheep and rely on cover crops quite a bit, and not have to have as big of a farm. So it's a way you can expand your flock. So, the reason why we plant cover crops is to increase the biodiversity. We don't want to continually disrupt the soil because you lose more carbon that way. And having these living roots also helps sequester carbon and helps keep the soil covered so you have less erosion. So that's what, this would be like more of a conventional situation. Here's cover crops. This was a few years ago. We've done different projects. This was an MSU farm. This was some Sudan grass that we planted and we grazed with the whole U flock. So there's different applications that you can use. This was planted in July, I think, right after wheat. Um, and so, we leave a lot of residue in the field. And we do some enhanced recycling by having this trampling effect where it incorporates better. um yeah, and so it makes it more available for the next crop. So it's important to have a good relationship with a crop farmer and maybe establish some of these agreements, like who buys the seed, how it's going to be done, um, and come up with an agreement. I just have a gentleman's agreement with my neighbor. I've never really had to get too formal, but it'd be good if you were starting off with a new client somewhere. You need to cover all of these different questions. To me, probably the bigger question is like making sure you can keep your animals secure on their farm, and yeah, how you're going to manage the cover crop. Um, so we use electronet, as I mentioned already. Uh, And the types of mixtures that we have, this is kind of a cool figure here. It looks like the periodic chart, but it's just showing you the different kind of species that you want to have. So if you want a diverse cover crop, you can choose from these different functional groups, some people call them. Here's a bunch of grasses. Here's a number of small seeded, like brassica type species. Here's a good selection of legumes. And here's some more warm season grasses here. And so all of these crops, if you increase the diversity of the crop, the nice thing is if you've got like a weird germination year, you get something to germinate no matter what, because you've got something there. But there's a point where, you start adding too much diversity to the crop. Some of these are pretty expensive seeds, so you don't want to go overboard on that. And I don't know what the happy medium is exactly. I found like a 4 plant mix is pretty useful for our application. You don't want to add like too much expensive seed to it. Most of our cover crops are going to cost us like $15 an acre in seed, which is pretty cheap. You could pay a lot more. Some people pay a lot more, and I don't know if they really get a lot more value out of it. We've gotten some tremendous yields from some of these crops when planted, especially on heavily fertilized fields. We've gotten up to 4 to 5 tons per acre. I've showed you some pictures in my previous presentation of some of those. And when we look at the cost of gain for some of these lambs, we can really reduce the cost of gain quite a bit with some of these cover crop fields compared to a grain feedlot. I make it look like perennial pasture can be a good deal here, even better deal, and it can be. But usually, you have to realize that I'm saying cost of gain, but the gains aren't going to be as high as they will be in a feedlot. And I'll describe here. We can get some decent gains, just enough to probably finish lambs, as I'll describe. But it isn't. It isn't. They're never going to grow as fast as they are in grain. Sorry, no matter how hard you try. So we wanted to compare the yield, the value of the nutritional value of these crops, lamb growth rates, and their carcass merit. And we're actually going to hopefully in the future do some sensory evaluation of our meat we've harvested from these lambs. The problem is the pandemic has kept us from doing that, but we'll get that done in the next year. So what we've done is we compared it. We're comparing, I'll show you the treatments just a minute, 2 types of cover crops, a diverse mix and a brassica dominant mix. Then we've also got another treatment was, so we kept them on those crops the whole rearing period. Then we had another treatment that was brassica cover crop followed by grain for 4 weeks. And then the last period treatment was just grain only as kind of our control. So here they are, grain, brassica cover crop mix, a mixture, which was a bunch of different species you can see here of legumes, more diverse. It costs a little bit more. And then the background, which was 8 weeks. The grain diet, we only fed for 6 weeks, which isn't stated here. It should be. The rest of them were 8 weeks because lambs on grain are going to grow significantly faster. So, you can't really have them on the treatment as long. So here's just an example of these cover crop mixes. You can see the diverse mix cost more. The more simple mix here was about $20 per acre. This is 30. It isn't a huge amount more, but it's significant. The way we did this is we simply had this field where we randomly applied our treatments. We had replicated the design so that we could do proper statistics on it. So we had replications of each treatment, 3 of them, and they were kind of mixed throughout the field here. So this is like a 9-acre field, and we just made all these little micro paddocks and went down these long strips and grazed them. We had, I believe, 5 lambs in a strip, 15 lambs per treatment, 4 treatments, so 60 lambs. We'd hoped to have grazed more lambs than that. We had prepared to graze more in a treatment strip, but we just did not. Both the years we did this project, repeated it in 2 years, we had really droughty August, so we didn't get as much cover crop. I think on a normal year, you could have planted more. So here's just a picture of us seeding it in August. This was 2 years ago, so this is August of 19, and this was a super dry August. So this crop just kind of sat there in the ground for about 2 weeks before it thought about, and then we got a rain, and it really didn't germinate that year, but we eventually did get a decent crop. So here's our grain control group fed in the barn. We had to transition the lambs from a pasture diet to grain, and this is just showing how we did it. So we can take lambs from a pasture only diet, put them on all they can eat mixture of just soy hulls and our primary grain mix. And so we put them right on that, all they can eat right off pasture. They don't get sick. And then we gradually reduce the soy hull and start, and after 8 or 9 days, we're back to 100% grain. So this is a very good transition program that we use, and we've been using it for many years. So our grazing management, we just move these lambs every week. So we had a little latitude. If it was a really particularly bad day, we moved them between 6 and 8 day intervals, 7 days on average. And so the way we determined how much forage we were going to allow these lambs, so they were grazing, I think it was like an 40-foot wide strip. And what we did is we weighed the lambs weekly, and then we gave them the amount of forage that we estimated to be 9% of their body weight on a dry matter basis. So we knew the yield of each little strip because we did a pre-grazing cut of it where we determined its mass, and then we allocated them at 9% on a dry matter basis of their body weight. So the lambs eat probably 4 to 5% of their body weight. So we allowed them to waste about half of what's out there, which is fine because it's a cover crop after all, and you can trample it into the ground, and that's all good for the next crop anyhow. So we kind of asked them to take about half of what was there. By doing that, we got better gains and probably better benefits to the field as well. Okay. And sometimes we had to adjust this a little bit. So we grazed them from the early season, the crops growing like gangbusters, all the way through a pretty heavy snow we had this year. And the lambs, their growth did slow down in the cold weather. We had a really cold fall 2019. And that's one thing I'll show you in the results. They did slow down. So here shows you how they eat the brassicas. At first, they don't eat the bulbs. Eventually they kind of scallop them out of the ground. So this is a giant purple top turnip. I wish I would showed you a picture before. It's like the size of, like, bigger than a grapefruit. And you can see how they kind of scallop it right to the ground. And so we would have to do pre and post grazing measurements. And that's a lot of work actually, with all these quadrants. So we cut all the area within a certain defined surface area, and pick up all these bags of forage on the field and weigh it and dry it. And we also did some botanical composition, and we had some good help from the lambs, of course, who were always wanting to help us with the project. And these are my students' pictures. So she has a different perspective on her work than I do, which is fun. And then so here's a picture of our diverse cover crop mix on the bottom and our brassica dominant mix here. And you can see this stuff right here is actually, let me try to get a different pointer here. This stuff right here is winter wheat. So this was a wheat field. And so this is volunteer wheat that came up because when you plant this cover crop mix, you're going to bury some of the grain that spilled onto the field. And wheat's pretty nice, actually. Wheat is a really good crop, really high quality. So having some of that in there was no worries as long as you got plenty of your cover crop established. So this is not nearly as diverse of a mix as this one is, and there's a lot more wheat in this one as well. And we had one of these portable weighing systems. We got it from New Zealand, where we have it out in our field that allows us to do these kinds of studies. So we weighed the lambs right in the field, and we didn't have to go too far away, move the lambs very far away from their little grazing paddock to weigh them and take blood samples and fecal samples and everything else we were trying to do. So we have a commercial medium-sized plant in Michigan. It's a really nice place called Wolverine Packing. So we took all the lambs there, killed them at the end of the study, and looked at their carcass merit. And here's just a picture of some of the lambs. These were grazing cover crop mix. These were backgrounded on cover crops and finished on grain. They all look pretty decent, don't they? They're all really nice lambs, actually. So here shows you the biomass. We call it, I don't know why she calls it pure, but anyhow, it's the brassica mixture. There's a little bit more of that growing than the more diverse mix. So we had a little bit greater biomass. This was a poor year. We only got about 2 tons. Most years I get closer to 3 or even closer to 4. But even with this poor amount, we still got a lot of good grazing out of it. And so you can see that we missed a sample because there was a snowstorm in November. So that happens. Here's just a picture of us, um, of the crop, and it's just full of water. I mean, the tubers are over 90% water, and the tops they vary a little bit over the grazing season, so there's heaps of water. So we didn't have to provide any supplemental water to these lambs because they were getting all of their water met by grazing. And here it shows you, that relationship between air temperature and the amount of forage water you need to meet requirements of sheep. And this shows you where tubers are, which are very wet, and the tops are all above here too. So we were meeting the requirements for water. This shows you the botanical compositions of the crops, which I showed you visually. And so here's the body weights. For some reason, these got a little messed up here in translation. I'm not sure why, but the grain lambs were a little bit bigger than the pasture lambs here. Our background lambs were similar weight. Um, and so we did grow a little bit bigger lambs. These weren't, I think they averaged around 115, 120 pounds. And these were closer to 130-pound lambs. So it's about a 10-pound difference, if I remember well. Which so those pasture lambs grew very well. I mean, they weren't doing badly by any means, but they just didn't quite achieve the same weights. And here you see their average daily gains. Obviously, this shows you the whole picture. We were getting gains closer to a pound a day on the background and grain-fed lambs. But when they're in pasture, as shown here, this is backgrounded lambs, they're closer to half a pound a day. Then they double when you put them on grain. And then the pasture lambs are sticking there right around that half a pound a day. But then what we found is our period 2, which is the last 4 weeks of the treatment, because it got so cold. This particular year, they dropped off in their performance. They were going closer to 250, 300, 0.25, 0.3 pounds per day. So they slowed down a little bit. This last year, we didn't see that at all. They grew at the same rate all the way through December. So it had a lot to do with the cold weather. So here shows you the hot carcass weights of the pasture lambs. They're lighter a little bit than the grain-fed lambs, whether they're backgrounded or not. These are pretty nice carcass weights. They're almost 70 pounds. The back fats were actually surprisingly similar. So our pasture lambs really were put on enough. A lot of people will call 0.2 inches like a nicely finished lamb. These are very close, and they all graded yield grade 2 or choice. And so they're very nice lambs. Body wall thickness is another indicator. They're always a little bit lighter here on the pasture lambs. Our loin eye areas were very nice for lambs like this. And our yield grades were all, pretty similar, a little leaner, but certainly acceptable. And so we're going to measure the, carcass fatness or the meat fat, the amount of intramuscular fat in these as well to see how they compare. But I would argue, at least from visually, from what we see in carcass quality, these pasture lambs did really well. So what we think this system can work even when Mother Nature is difficult, but you need to match your stocking density to match the forage and grazing conditions. Um, I would say that if you're going to expect the cover crop to emerge in late August, it's almost too late in the year. That's what happened in this year because we had a dry August. So most years that's not such an issue. But yeah, and we had everything go wrong that year. We had an early hard frost, but we still had pretty good growth. And I would say the exotic cover crop mixtures actually will increase the seed cost, but not necessarily adding apparent value to lamb gains is what we saw. Do they have environmental benefits? Like, are they better for the soil? Possibly. I don't know if that's something we'll be able to measure or not, but we're just going to put it in there as a question. And we found that 4 week of backgrounding on cover crops followed by feedlot gave us these really nice looking lambs that potentially is, perhaps the most efficient system. So yeah, so that's pretty much what I have to present. If you have any questions that you'd like me to answer, you still have, there's time. I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions you have.
There is a question from Teresa. She wants to know, how do the sheep adjust when rotating from grass to legumes? Like, does changing the feed affect them?
Yeah, no, you have to be conscious of that. So our sheep were had to transition from mostly grass, a little legume content, to brassica, which is a pretty different plant species. So we did it over a week of time, and it seemed to work pretty well. Um, so what we did is, I remember in the headland of that field, it was adjacent to another pasture, and we allowed the lambs access to the headland of the field and to the pasture. And after about 2 or 3 days, they started going into the brassica field more. And by the end, they were eating it pretty well. So we did it over about a week of time. And I think that works pretty well. There is some concern with brassica uh, species that they can cause they have some secondary compounds that happen that are produced in the process of digestion that can sometimes cause health issues to lambs. We didn't see any evidence for that, but there is a literature on it. And the other thing potentially that they could do, even though they're really high quality forage, they potentially could imbue some kind of off flavors to the meat or milk.
Hmm.
And that's, at least that's like, I'm not sure how well documented it is, but that's like, at least, I don't know, what do you want to call it? Like part of the conventional thought with farmers. And so that's one thing we're going to test directly, because you sit out in a cover crop field in November, December while it's rotting. It can be like pretty amazing, the smell. And even in our part of Michigan, they had all of these civil complaints from people in town because they thought there was like animals dying in these fields, and all it was rotting brassica. So,
Wow.
that can be a little bit of an issue, that smell, and people perceive it could imbue flavors to the meat. But I'm going to be surprised if that's the case.
Yeah, I wanted to volunteer to be a taste tester.
Yeah. Hopefully we get to do the project. I think we can. The problem is we can't do this stuff on campus for a while, but we might get a private firm to do it for us. So that's
Mhm.
what we might end up doing. Yeah.
That's interesting. We've fed some brassicas, and we had Swedes and rutabagas, and we just tried a whole bunch of different stuff. We weren't even measuring growth. We were just trying to see what they grew like and whether the sheep would eat them. And
Yeah.
they ate everything. They left the stalks on some of the big brassicas, but then they would those brassicas would push new leaves. It was really surprising.
Yeah. When we grow some of the leafy turnip varieties, some of them they have some cabbage and turnip genetics in them. Those are really great summer crops. We can multi-graze those like 4 times almost, and you can get tremendous growth out of them. And not all of them are designed to graze more than once, but yeah, there's some pretty nice options out there depending on what your goals are.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of the problem of having them get frosted and then be rotting. I suppose that's when the little grasses that are under there, the wheat and things, are nice to have in the mix.
Yeah, we don't see we didn't really have that problem like in our fields necessarily, but yeah, occasionally you just have just the right conditions where you get an early frost and then a warm
And
December.
wet, yeah.
Yeah, and then you get like the smell that is kind of
Yeah, the
overwhelms
rotten
some
cabbage
people.
smell. Yeah.
Rotten cabbage smell, exactly. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yep.
And did you find I don't know if you had many turnips or rutabagas and that sort of thing in there. Were they eating the bulbs or just cutting them off at the top, kind of?
Um. Yeah. So it's a little bit of learning that they do on bulbs.
Yep.
Um. I found that, yeah, if you let them be too selective, they might not eat the bulbs right away. But I found after about 3 weeks of exposure, they start eating them and really kind of
Looking
almost
for them.
selecting for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. But at first, they don't. And so that's it. It's the bulbs are pretty high in energy, but a little lower in protein. They're
Hmm.
also so wet that if you can almost have a problem with not enough dry matter in forage if you're grazing bulbs. Like the issue of water, it's almost like they're drowning. There's too much water.
Yeah, I was surprised when I saw that in your presentation. I didn't,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem like they have that much water, but I guess they do if you dry
They're-
them down.
Yeah, the bulbs can be 95% water. They're super lush.
But they're so solid. They don't seem like it.
Yeah, yeah. No, they're between 90 and 95%.
That's why they smell so bad when they start rotting.
That's probably true.
It happens quick.
Yep.
You're doing a lot of really interesting things out there. That's pretty neat.
Well, I think the cover crop is a win-win for cover crop grazing with sheep is kind of a win-win. It's easier to do with sheep than cattle because of the soil compaction issues. And
They
I
don't punch
think-
holes and everything either.
yeah, people wouldn't want to, because what happens in late fall, as you would know probably as well in your climate, you get some late fall rains and the ground's just barely frozen, and you can get a pretty big mud hole in a quick hurry. And so I always set up enough fence for my ewes grazing out there so that I can get them off of a field like right away and put them on. I always set up in advance. Occasionally, when we have these mud conditions, which only last usually a few days, we want to move them off those areas and just let that go to waste. So you don't want them to muddy up a field because it's bad for the sheep and bad for the field.
Mm-hmm.
One time only, we had this unusual condition in late or very early January, 2 years ago, I think. We had like a really warm December, and then it rained a real lot, and the sheep were suddenly standing in 3 inches of mud. And it dropped to like 0 degrees like the next day. So they're basically like trudging through mud and getting super cold. And that's the only time we ever had like a welfare issue with the sheep. And so that was a very unusual, I've done this for 10, 12 years, and it's always been the sheep are healthier on the cover crop than they ever would be in the barn. But you just got to monitor those rare things could happen. You have to keep track of. Yep.
And most of these cover crops are going in after small grains.
Yeah. So, cover crops we plant it out after any crop, but the problem is if it's after corn,
It's our problem. It's usually after corn, and
there's not an opportunity then because there's not enough growing days. Although if you were to plant cereal rye, for example, which is, you could plant it after silage corn. So silage corn, most places many parts of the country is taken off in September, and there's enough degree growing days to at least establish cereal rye, and that's often planted then, and then that can provide pretty good grazing this next spring because it'll.
Yeah, so I was thinking maybe in April. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. But I would say that's what we said, if you're not, at least in this climate, if you were to plant like after the end of August, it wouldn't be worth it. Or at least have it come up during August. I've planted in the 20s of August myself in my own private farming thing and done fine, but I wouldn't go after Labor Day. I don't think it wouldn't be
Wouldn't get enough
degree growing days. Yeah.
And the other question I wanted to ask you is, how old is your youngest set of boys? Are you going to lose your farm help is what I'm asking.
Yeah, it is a problem. I do have someone I hire who helps me a little bit, but yeah, they're seniors in high school right now. So that's a issue. Yeah.
I found some good kids in the neighborhood, but that are good workers. So I'm lucky. But,
yeah. I think that's that. I do have a employee who's really good who helps me part-time, but yeah, it might have to. We found like we have a few egg programs, like FFA programs, and some of those young folks are pretty keen to learn new things. So I imagine I'll
get some people trained.
Get a few people trained too. It can be kind of fun.
Get them turned on to sheep.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
And forages and grazing and all that great stuff that we all like to do. So, well, thank you so much, Richard. It said here, are you clipping the pastures? That was a question. After your sheep come out?
Yep.
not very common that I would need to clip a pasture. Um, we occasionally would under certain circumstances, like maybe once or twice we've gotten into a pasture that's overly mature and we've had reason to clip it afterwards. But it would be an uncommon situation for us to need to do that. If I were to, because I usually don't allow that to happen because I can harvest, I have my own hay harvest equipment. If I was a smaller farm or I didn't want to invest in hay harvest equipment, which is a reasonable question,
Mhm.
for sure. I mean, really, I'm overcapitalized on my farm. I shouldn't probably own this equipment, but I had a bigger farm, so I kept it. That's an interesting discussion. But anyhow, if I were just managing pasture without being able to do machine harvest, I probably would clip pastures because I'd almost be forced to. If I couldn't get another farmer to come in and harvest my pasture excess, I would be doing some pasture clipping, so that'd be a different situation. I don't have to do the clipping because I just harvest it for winter feed.
That probably helps keep your thistles and other pasture challenges down also.
Yeah, that's a great point, Betsy. Yeah, occasionally that's one reason why I might clip a pasture. When I do a new seeding and I'll do a first pass grazing of it, occasionally there'll be some thistles or some pigweed or something, the amaranth that's, still there. And I'd like the, new seeding to compete more effectively. So I might do a clipping after a first pass grazing on a new
Mhm.
seeding, or a situation where maybe I have some thistles starting to encroach in the pasture. That happens where I sometimes do some winter feeding outside and I have some areas that are, damaged from the winter, and I'll get some, or just from the thatch left over, or
Yep.
thistle, there's a lot of fertility there, but thistles will grow. And then, those areas I might do some clipping on too. But yeah,
Yeah, they can be very frustrating.
yeah.
They're very well evolved. Well, thank you. Really, really appreciate you taking time in the evening to talk to us and to share your PowerPoint and to go to the trouble to record some in case you weren't here. And
Yeah, no, it's no problem. I just
really
wanted
fun
to,
to,
I didn't want to leave you high and dry, and I also had another commitment I really want to go to. So, but luckily it got out early, and I got here on time. So glad that happened. Yep.
yeah, thanks so much. And maybe I won't get to be on your call next week with the experienced shepherds, but
Oh
I'm
yeah.
sure we'll be in touch again soon. So thanks so
Okay.
much.
You're welcome. Yeah. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
And so I'm going to stop the recording.